The basement had always been a place of mystery for me. It was one of those rooms in our house that never seemed to serve much purpose. A sprawling, dimly lit area beneath the ground floor, with a lingering chill that never seemed to go away. The light bulb, the only source of illumination down there, barely worked. It flickered every now and then, casting elongated shadows on the damp concrete walls. Most days I avoided it altogether. But one evening, a series of strange incidents finally drew me back down there, where I uncovered a truth that would haunt me forever. My fascination with the basement began when I was young, back when the basement felt like a forbidden place, almost a challenge to my curiosity. My parents told me to stay out of it, claiming it was just a storage space filled with old furniture and broken appliances. And for years I obeyed, only venturing down when I had to grab something or help my dad with a chore. But as time passed, I started noticing things that didn't add up, little oddities that gnawed at my curiosity. One evening, as I walked by the basement door, I thought I heard something. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping sound, almost like someone knocking slowly on a wooden surface. I paused, thinking it might be the pipes or the house settling, as older houses often do. But there was something unnatural about the sound, something almost deliberate. I stood there for a while, straining my ears, but it stopped as quickly as it started. I brushed it off as a trick of my mind, a phantom noise that was easily explained away. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just knocking. There were faint whispers, soft and unintelligible, as if someone were having a hushed conversation just on the other side of the door. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the door, but I couldn't make out any words. When I opened the door and flicked on the light switch, the basement was silent, as it always was. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there, lurking in the shadows. I began to feel an odd pull toward the basement. It was as if a part of me wanted to go down there, to explore every corner, to find something that was waiting for me. The feeling was strange, almost unnatural, but it was persistent. Each day the urge grew stronger, until finally I gave in. The next day I made a decision I was going to spend some time in the basement, really look around and put my mind at ease. I gathered a flashlight and a notepad, determined to document anything I found. It was late afternoon when I finally descended the creaking wooden stairs, the dim light overhead barely cutting through the gloom. The basement was exactly as I remembered it, cluttered and damp, with the faint scent of mildew hanging in the air. Boxes were stacked haphazardly in one corner, and old furniture lay draped in dusty sheets. There were a few cardboard boxes filled with knickknacks and other odds and ends, but nothing seemed out of place. But then I noticed something odd. Against the far wall, there was a small door that I hadn't seen before. It was low, barely reaching my knees, and painted the same color as the wall, almost camouflaged. My heart raced as I approached it. I had been in the basement countless times over the years, and yet I had never noticed this door. It was locked, but the lock looked old and rusty, as if it hadn't been touched in years. I felt a sudden urge to open it, as if whatever lay behind that door held the answer to the questions that had been haunting me. I searched around and found a small metal rod which I used to pry the lock open. It took a bit of effort, but finally the lock gave way, and the door swung open with a low creak. Behind the door was a narrow passage, just wide enough for me to squeeze through. I shone my flashlight into the darkness and saw that it led deeper underground. The air was thick and stale, and there was an unsettling silence that seemed to swallow the sound of my breathing. I hesitated, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear, so I ducked down and entered the passage. The walls were rough and unfinished, with clumps of dirt and rock jutting out at odd angles. I could feel the ground sloping downward as I moved forward, each step taking me deeper into the earth. The passage twisted and turned, and I found myself getting disoriented. I had no idea how far I had gone, but it felt like miles. Then, I reached a small chamber. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange objects, old bottles filled with cloudy liquids, jars of what looked like herbs, and other things I couldn't quite identify. There was a small wooden table in the center, covered in dust and cobwebs, with a single, tattered notebook lying open on its surface. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I turned the pages. The notebook was filled with handwritten notes, scribbles, and drawings. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, and I could barely make out the words. But as I read, a chill ran down my spine. The notes described rituals, strange practices, and instructions for contacting something that wasn't human. The further I read, the more disturbed I became. Whoever had written this was obsessed, driven by a need to commune with whatever lay beyond the veil of our world. But that wasn't the worst part. In the margins of the notebook, there were small drawing sketches of faces contorted in agony, with hollow eyes and twisted mouths. They looked almost lifelike, as if they had been drawn from memory. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. Then I saw it. A drawing that stopped me cold. It was a face I recognized my face. The eyes were sunken, the mouth twisted into a silent scream. I dropped the notebook, stumbling back, my mind racing. How could this be? How could someone have drawn me down here in this hidden chamber? I felt a surge of panic, a desperate need to escape. I turned and ran back down the passage, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I scrambled through the narrow space. I could feel something behind me, a presence that I couldn't see, but could feel, creeping closer with each step. I reached the door and slammed it shut, my heart racing as I fumbled to replace the rusty lock. I stumbled back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked it, pressing my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. I stood there for a long time, my mind reeling. I told myself that it was just a nightmare, that I had imagined it all, but deep down I knew the truth. I had uncovered something down there, something that shouldn't have been found. Over the next few days, I tried to push it out of my mind, but the basement was always there, a dark presence lurking beneath my feet. The knocking sounds continued, growing louder each night, and the whispers became more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were meant for me. It was as if the basement was calling to me, pulling me back into its depths. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth. I grabbed my flashlight and descended the stairs once more, feeling a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. The door was still there, the passage waiting for me, as if it had been expecting my return. I entered the passage, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. As I moved forward, I could feel the air growing colder, the walls closing in around me. I reached the chamber, and there it was, the notebook, lying open on the table. But this time there was something else, a small mirror, cracked and covered in dust. I picked it up, and as I looked into it, I saw my reflection distorted and twisted, just like the drawings in the notebook, but this time I wasn't alone. Behind me I saw a figure, tall and shadowy, with hollow eyes and a twisted mouth, its hand reaching out toward me. I dropped the mirror, backing away, but it was too late. I could feel its presence wrapping around me, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember was the cold, relentless grip of that presence, dragging me down into the abyss. I don't know how long I was down there lost in the darkness, but when I finally woke up, I was lying on the basement floor, alone. The door was closed, the passage gone, as if it had never existed. I stumbled back up the stairs, my mind numb, my body trembling. I locked the basement door and threw away the key, vowing never to go down there again. But the memories haunt me still, the shadows lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, the whispers that echo in my mind. I know now that the basement was never just a room, never just a storage space. It was a gateway, a doorway to something beyond my understanding, something dark and ancient that had been waiting for me all along. And I had found it, or maybe it had found me. Every now and then I hear the knocking, the whispers, and I feel the pull, the irresistible urge to go back down there, to open the door, to face whatever lies waiting in the darkness. But I know that if I give in to that urge, I may not come back. For weeks I've tried to convince myself that it was all just a hallucination, that maybe I'd breathed in something toxic, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But no matter how I try to rationalize it, the fear lingers. I started seeing faces in the windows at night, shadows slipping just out of sight. When I close my eyes, I still see the twisted face from the mirror, hovering just behind me, as if it's waiting for the right moment to reach out again. I stop sleeping well. Every time I drift off, I'm jolted awake by the feeling that something is watching me. I even tried moving my bed to the other side of the room, away from the basement door, but it didn't help. It's as if the whole house is infected, as if whatever was in the basement is seeping up through the floorboards, wrapping itself around my mind. And then there's the notebook. I can't stop thinking about it. I didn't bring it back up with me, but I can picture it perfectly, the drawings, the frantic notes, my own face staring back at me. I wonder what else was in there, what secrets it held. But I can't bring myself to go back down there, to look for it. It's like a trap, a snare lying in wait for me. Yet, somehow I feel like the basement is calling to me. Every night, the knocking grows louder, the whispers more insistent. I can't make out the words, but they're growing more familiar, like a song you've heard 100 times but can't quite remember the lyrics to. It's a pull I can't explain, a compulsion that gnaws at my sanity. I've thought about telling someone, maybe a friend or even a stranger, anyone who might listen, but the words catch in my throat. I know how it sounds. I can hardly believe it myself, and I lived it. If I tell someone, they'll think I'm crazy. Maybe they'd be right. Maybe this is all in my head, just a trick of the mind. But some part of me knows the truth. Whatever I encountered down there was real. And it's not finished with me yet. A few days ago, I found muddy footprints leading up from the basement stairs. They were small, almost childlike, as if something had walked up from the depths of the earth and into my home. I scrubbed them away, but they came back the next morning, trailing through the house, always leading back to the basement door. I've started checking every night, but they're always there, fresh and wet, as if someone or something is trying to lure me back down. And then there was last night. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the whispers. I had grown almost used to them, the way they rise and fall like a faint, distant conversation. But then I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, clear and sharp, cutting through the darkness. It was calling my name. I froze, my heart pounding, straining to hear. It was the same voice I'd heard in my dreams, the voice that had haunted me since I'd found that hidden chamber. It was soft, almost soothing, but there was a darkness beneath it, a hunger that made my skin crawl. It called my name again, as if beckoning me, urging me to come closer. I wanted to ignore it, to block it out, but I felt myself getting out of bed, moving toward the basement door. I wasn't in control anymore. It was as if something else was guiding me, pulling me down the stairs, back to that terrible place where it all began. The door was unlocked, though I knew I had locked it. It swung open with ease, revealing the darkness beyond. I didn't have a flashlight this time, but I didn't need one. I could see well enough, as if the shadows were guiding me, leading me back to the hidden passage. The door to the passage was open, waiting for me. I hesitated, my heart racing, but I felt that pull again, stronger than ever. I stepped inside, feeling the cold embrace of the darkness wrapping around me, the walls closing in as I moved deeper into the earth. When I reached the chamber, the notebook was gone, but the mirror was still there, lying cracked and broken on the table. I picked it up, my fingers trembling, and looked into it. For a moment I saw nothing but my own reflection, pale and terrified. But then, slowly, my face began to change. My eyes grew hollow, my mouth twisting into that same silent scream. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was as if the mirror was holding me, trapping me in its reflection, showing me a glimpse of the darkness within. And then I saw it, the shadowy figure, standing just behind me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. I could feel its presence, cold and relentless, its twisted mouth forming words that I couldn't hear. I knew then that it was too late, that I had gone too far, that I had crossed a line I could never come back from. The last thing I remember was the mirror shattering, the darkness closing in, and that terrible voice whispering my name over and over like a curse that would follow me forever. I don't know how I made it back to my room, but when I woke up, the basement door was closed, and the house was silent. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, a nightmare brought on by lack of sleep and too much stress. But I can still feel it, the darkness lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for me to make one wrong move. I don't go down to the basement anymore. I don't even look at the door. But I know it's there, waiting for me like a trap set, just for me. And I know that one day, no matter how hard I try to resist, I'll find myself standing at the top of those stairs, staring down into the darkness, ready to answer the call. Because once the basement has you, it never lets you go. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking, something I'd missed. I started noticing small details that made my skin crawl. The basement door would sometimes be unlocked, even when I was sure I'd locked it. Things around the house started to feel off, photos moved, items I hadn't touched in years left out on the kitchen counter. I brushed it off as my nerves, until one evening I made a horrifying discovery. I was in the living room, pacing, when I noticed something strange in one of the family photos hanging on the wall. It was a recent picture from a family gathering. At first glance it looked normal enough, but there, in the background, half hidden in shadow, was a familiar face. My heart skipped a beat. It was the figure from the basement, the one with hollow eyes and that terrible grin. I felt the blood drain from my face as I leaned in closer. In photo after photo, there it was, always in the background, always just out of sight. I started to piece it together, the dread thickening in my stomach. This wasn't some supernatural presence. No, it was someone real, someone who had been watching me for a long time, someone close. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I remembered my cousin Mike. He'd moved in with us temporarily last year after he'd lost his job. We didn't talk much, but he'd seemed harmless. I remembered him spending a lot of time in the basement, which I thought was just him trying to keep out of the way. I hadn't seen him in months, though, since he'd supposedly moved out. But the way he acted back then, the way he'd always been quiet and seemed to blend into the background, took on a new, horrifying light. With trembling hands, I made my way back to the basement, trying to steady my breathing. The closer I got, the clearer the memories became. I'd find things out of place, small disturbances that made me wonder. But I dismissed them as nothing. My heart raced as I opened the door and flicked on the light. There, in a dark corner, hidden behind a stack of boxes, I found something that made me recoil. It was a small space, hollowed out between the walls, with a few ragged blankets and personal items scattered around items that belonged to me. A photo from my bedroom, my toothbrush, a shirt I thought I'd lost. It was a makeshift hiding spot, a place where someone could watch and listen undetected. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Mike hadn't left. He'd been living down here, quietly slipping into the shadows whenever I came close. I realized he must have been watching me all along, hiding in plain sight, moving around the house while I slept. And then it hit me, the figure in the mirror, the footsteps, the knocking. It had all been him. He wasn't a ghost or a demon. He was real, and he had been right there, watching, waiting. I felt sick to my stomach as I turned and ran back upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. The horror of knowing he'd been there all along, living in the shadows, was more terrifying than any ghost story. I never found him after that. He vanished, disappearing without a trace. But the memories linger, and sometimes late at night, I swear I hear the soft creak of footsteps just beyond the basement door, a reminder that some horrors are closer than we ever want to believe. It started like any other day, mundane, uneventful, the kind of day where nothing extraordinary happens, and that was fine by me. I was never one for excitement. My life revolved around routines: work, home, the occasional coffee with a friend. It was quiet, predictable. Maybe too predictable, but I liked it that way, or at least I thought I did. I lived alone in a small 2-story house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything special, just a modest place with peeling paint and a lawn that always seemed to need mowing. The kind of house that blended into the background, forgotten as soon as it was seen. But it was home. I didn't have much family to speak of, just an estranged brother I hadn't talked to in years, and my parents had passed long ago. So I kept to myself most of the time, content with my own company, or so I told myself. One evening after work, I decided to go through some old boxes in the basement. It wasn't a task I particularly looked forward to, but it was one of those things I kept putting off. The basement in my house had always been a source of unease for me. Not because it was particularly creepy, just the usual dark and musty kind of place you'd expect from an older house, but there was something about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It felt heavy, almost like the air was thicker down there. I hadn't been down in years, not since I moved in. I remember storing a few things after the move, boxes of junk, mostly old papers, clothes, a couple of family heirlooms I didn't have the heart to throw away. But beyond that, the basement remained unused, an afterthought. That night, though, something drove me to go down there. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe it was something else. Looking back, I think I knew even then that something wasn't right, but I didn't want to admit it. Not yet. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The basement light hadn't worked in years. Another thing I kept telling myself I'd fix, but never did. The stairs creaked as I descended, each step groaning under my weight. The air grew colder the farther I went, and the smell of damp earth hit me as I reached the bottom. I flicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the bare concrete floor and walls. There were the boxes, piled up against the far wall, just where I had left them. I started going through them, pulling out old photo albums, some worn-out clothes, things that had long since lost their relevance in my life. But as I dug deeper, I found something I didn't remember: packing a small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, tucked away at the bottom of a larger one. It was plain, unmarked, nothing special to look at. Yet, there was something about it that drew me in. I opened it, expecting to find more junk, maybe some old trinkets I'd forgotten about. Instead, there were papers yellowed with age, brittle at the edges. I picked one up, and as I read the words scrawled across it in uneven handwriting, a cold chill ran down my spine. They were journal entries, but not mine. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the things written inside they didn't make sense. At first it was just ramblings, incoherent thoughts about someone being watched, followed, though there was never any mention of who or why. Then, as I read further, the entries grew darker, more detailed. There were mentions of strange sounds in the house whispers, footsteps in the night, things moving on their own. I should have stopped reading, but I couldn't. It was like watching a car crash. You know you shouldn't look, but you can't tear your eyes away. The entries became more frantic, more paranoid. Whoever wrote them was terrified, convinced that someone or something was in the house with them. It was hard to tell how much of it was real and how much was just the author's deteriorating mind playing tricks. But then, one of the last entries caught my eye. I can't take it anymore. They're here. Always here, watching, waiting. I know what they want. But they won't take me. I won't let them. This ends tonight. That was it. No explanation, no closure. Just that final cryptic sentence. I sat there for a moment, the box still in my lap, my heart racing in my chest. My first thought was that it had to be a prank. Maybe the previous owner left it behind as some kind of sick joke. But that didn't make sense. The house had been empty for years before I bought it. And why would someone go to such lengths? I told myself it didn't matter. It was just an old journal, the product of a disturbed mind. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I put the box back, closed it, and pushed it into the corner, hoping that would be the end of it. I went back upstairs, trying to shake the unease that clung to me like a wet blanket. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and gnawing anxiety. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about the things written in it. Every creak of the floorboards, every draft of cold air felt like a sign, a warning. I started hearing things, faint sounds in the house when I was sure I was alone. At first it was subtle, just the occasional soft thud or a barely audible whisper. But soon it became more frequent, more distinct. Footsteps above me when I was in the basement, the sound of doors opening and closing upstairs when I knew I hadn't touched them. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was letting the journal get to me. But deep down I knew. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew. One night as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving down the hall toward my room. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I sat up, listening, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the door creaked open. I froze, my eyes locked on the doorway, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. The door was open, but the hallway beyond was empty. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear. I sat there, clutching the sheets, waiting for anything to happen. But the minutes stretched on, and nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to move, to get out of bed and close the door. I locked it, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I wasn't alone in the house, and I knew it. The next day, I decided to go back to the basement. I didn't want to, but I felt like I had to. There was something down there, something I needed to understand. I grabbed the flashlight again and made my way down the creaky stairs, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the bottom, I saw it immediately, the box. It was open. I know I closed it. I know I put it away. But there it was, the lid askew, the papers spilling out. My hands shook as I bent down to pick up the journal. This time I noticed something I hadn't before. There was more. At the very bottom of the box, beneath the papers, was a photograph. It was old, black and white, the edges frayed and worn. It showed a family standing in front of my house, 2 parents and a little boy, smiling at the camera. But there was something off about the picture. The house in the background looked different, newer, but the most unsettling thing was the boy. His face, it was blurred, distorted, like something had smeared it. I flipped the photo over, and on the back, in the same shaky handwriting as the journal, were the words he never left. I dropped the photo, my heart racing. I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't need to. I felt it. That heavy, suffocating feeling I'd had since the moment I stepped into the basement. It wasn't just my imagination. There was something here, something that had always been here. I don't know why, but I turned around, shining the flashlight along the walls, scanning the room. That's when I saw it. In the far corner, near where the boxes had been stacked, was a small door, one I'd never noticed before. It was old, almost hidden by the shadows, and covered in dust and cobwebs. My stomach churned as I walked toward it, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave the basement and never come back. But I couldn't. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark space, barely big enough for a person to fit inside. The smell hit me first, rotting wood, dampness, and something else, something metallic. I shone the flashlight inside, and there, in the corner of the cramped space, was a small wooden chair, and on the floor beneath it, dark stains. Blood. I stumbled back, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just an old basement filled with forgotten junk and eerie stories. This was something much darker, something that had been hidden away for a reason. The bloodstains looked old, dried into the cracks of the floor, but the sight of them made my skin crawl. The small chair, positioned almost like it was waiting for someone, sat empty, but the atmosphere around it felt suffocating, like the room was holding its breath. I slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the basement. My body was trembling, my mind trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Who had been here? What had happened? And why was it hidden so carefully away in my home, a home I thought I knew? I wanted to run upstairs, leave the basement, and never come back, but something stopped me. It wasn't just fear. It was the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I had the distinct impression that someone was watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung the flashlight around, searching the darkness for any movement, any sign that I wasn't imagining things. That's when I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper. At first, I couldn't make out the words. It sounded distant, like it was coming from deep within the walls, but then it became clearer, more insistent, as if it was moving closer. He's still here. The voice, raspy and hollow, sent a chill down my spine. I whipped the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing. The room was empty, just cold concrete and forgotten boxes. But the voice, there was no mistaking it. Someone had spoken, and it wasn't in my head. Panic gripped me as I turned and bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet in my rush to escape. I reached the top and slammed the door behind me, locking it as if that could somehow keep whatever was down there from following me. I stood in the kitchen, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to calm myself down. But the silence that filled the house felt wrong, unnatural. It was too quiet. I strained to listen, half expecting to hear footsteps coming up from the basement, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive stillness that had taken hold of the house. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I had just experienced. Maybe it was stress. Maybe I had let the journal get to me more than I realized. But the bloodstains, the chair, the voice, those weren't hallucinations. They were real as the chill that clung to my skin. I needed answers. I couldn't stay in the house without knowing what was going on. The journal, the photo, the hidden door, it all pointed to something terrible that had happened here, something that someone had tried to forget. But whatever it was, it hadn't been forgotten. It was still here, lingering in the shadows. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the house sending a jolt of fear through me. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to open on its own again. But it didn't. Nothing happened, and yet, the tension in the air was unbearable. The next morning, I decided to do some digging. I needed to know more about the house, about its previous owners. Maybe the answers would help me make sense of what was happening. I drove to the local library, hoping to find something in the town's records. It took hours of searching through old newspapers and property deeds, but eventually I found what I was looking for. The house had belonged to a family named the Taylors in the 1950s. They had a son, Jacob, who had gone missing when he was just 8 years old. There were reports of strange occurrences in the house after his disappearance, voices, objects moving on their own, the family claiming they could still feel Jacob's presence. The authorities had written it off as grief-induced hysteria. The case went cold, and the family eventually moved away, leaving the house abandoned for years. Jacob had never been found. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I read the article. The boy in the photo, the one whose face had been blurred, that had to be Jacob. The journal, the bloodstains, the hidden room in the basement. It all started to make sense, but in the worst possible way. The Taylors must have tried to contact him to understand what had happened, but whatever they had done, it hadn't brought them peace. It had only stirred something dark, something they couldn't control. And now, all these years later, it had resurfaced. I drove home in a daze, the weight of what I had learned pressing down on me. The house felt different when I stepped inside, like the air had grown heavier, the shadows longer. I didn't want to go back to the basement, but I knew I had to. I needed to face whatever was down there, to put an end to it once and for all. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way back down, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to the hidden room was still closed, but I could feel the presence behind it, like a cold, invisible hand pressing against my skin. I stood in front of the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me, but I knew I didn't have a choice. I pulled the door open. The room was just as I had left it, the chair sitting ominously in the corner. But this time there was something different. A figure, small and shadowy, sat in the chair, its back to me, my breath caught in my throat as I stared, unable to move, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew who it was. I didn't need to see his face. I didn't need to hear his voice. Jacob. The air grew colder, the silence deafening. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Slowly, the figure began to turn, and as it did, the shadows seemed to close in around me, swallowing the light from the flashlight. And then I saw him. His face blurred, just like in the photograph. But there was something else, something more terrifying than the distortion. His eyes, they were empty, hollow, like two black pits that stared right through me, seeing everything, knowing everything. He opened his mouth, and the whisper returned, faint but unmistakable. I never left. That was the last thing I heard before everything went black. I woke up hours later, lying on the cold basement floor. The flashlight was dead, its beam long since faded. The door to the hidden room was closed, but the chair, the bloodstains, the feeling of being watched, they were all still there. I ran upstairs, locked the basement door, and didn't go back. But it didn't matter. I could still feel him, still hear the whispers in the walls, still see his hollow eyes in the dark corners of the house. Jacob had never left, and now neither could I. I've always considered myself a rational person. Life made sense through the lens of reason, science, and logic. Ghost stories were for campfires and children's tales, not for someone like me. I wasn't the type to scare easily, at least. That's what I used to believe. When I bought the house, it was meant to be a fresh start. I'd just gotten a new job in a small town, far from where I grew up, far from everything familiar. The house itself wasn't anything remarkable, an old, two-story place in a quiet neighborhood. It had been on the market for a while, but I didn't mind. In fact, I saw it as my luck. The price was a steal, and the place had character. I liked that it had a bit of history. The realtor mentioned, almost in passing, that the previous owner had passed away, but she didn't go into details. I didn't ask. At the time, I didn't want to know. People die, houses get sold. It's a simple, rational cycle. I didn't need to fill my head with morbid thoughts. The house felt empty when I moved in, hollow in that way old places often do, as if it were waiting to be filled again. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. I worked long days, spent my evenings unpacking, getting the house in order. There was something peaceful about the routine, the quiet nights, the unfamiliar streets, the feeling of being untethered to my past. The house, though a bit drafty, felt like a place where I could start anew. But then there was the basement. It wasn't fear, not at first, more like a strange discomfort. The basement door was at the far end of the hallway near the kitchen. Solid wood, heavy, with a brass handle that felt colder than it should have. Each time I passed it, I felt an odd chill, not just the cold air that seeped from beneath the door, but something deeper, more unsettling. I avoided going down there if I could help it. After all, I didn't need to. I'd stored a few boxes down there, old stuff, holiday decorations, tools I didn't use but nothing I needed on a regular basis. The first few noises I heard, I brushed off easily. Houses make noise. Creaking wood, pipes settling, all perfectly normal. I told myself it was the same here, but the noises became more distinct, more deliberate. At night, I'd hear soft sounds from below, the faint thud of something moving, or what I convinced myself was the wind slipping through some unseen crack in the foundation. I ignored it at first, told myself it was nothing. But the footsteps, they were harder to dismiss. The first time I heard them, I was sitting in the living room reading. A slow, steady thump from below, as if someone was pacing back and forth across the basement floor. I froze, my eyes darting to the basement door, which remained closed as it always did. I listened, trying to tell myself it was just an old house settling, just the echoes of years gone by. But the sounds were too regular, too heavy. I could hear each step deliberate, measured. I closed my book and waited, my heart pounding in my ears. After a while, the sound faded, and I breathed a little easier, but the feeling lingered. Days went by, and the noises didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. Always at night, always from the basement. It was worse when the house was silent, when all I could hear was the wind outside and the faint hum of the refrigerator. And below that, those footsteps. My nights grew restless. I found myself lying awake, waiting for the inevitable sounds. Sometimes it was the soft creak of the floorboards shifting, other times a faint knock like someone tapping from below. Each time I heard them, I felt a deep sense of unease crawling through me, a coldness that wasn't just in the air, but inside me. I tried to distract myself with work, with organizing the house, but the dread was always there, lingering at the edges of my mind. I would sit in the living room, trying to focus on a book or the TV, but my eyes would always drift toward the basement door. It felt wrong, unnatural, like it didn't belong. Then one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I woke to the sound of a loud crash, like something heavy had fallen in the basement. My heart leapt into my throat. I lay there in the dark, straining to listen. The house was still now, silent, but the weight of that sound hung in the air. I told myself it was just something shifting, maybe an old box falling over, but the thought didn't comfort me. That night, I didn't go down to check. I couldn't bring myself to. The fear was too sharp, too immediate. I stayed in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have caused the noise, but no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the fear lingered. The basement was hiding something. I didn't know what, but it was there, waiting. I started to obsess over it. During the day, I'd find myself thinking about the house, about the basement, about the noises that seemed to follow me, even when I wasn't there. I started asking around town, hoping to find out more about the house's history. One afternoon, I struck up a conversation with an old man at the local hardware store. He'd lived in the town his whole life and had known the previous owner, Richard Hale. I asked him about the house, about Hale, hoping to find something that would explain the unease I felt. The old man glanced around before speaking, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. Hale was a quiet man, he said, his voice low, kept to himself. But there was something strange about him, especially toward the end. He stopped going out, stopped talking to people. Some say he lost his mind, locked himself away in that house. They didn't find him for days after he died. I asked if he'd heard anything about the basement, about whether Hale had ever mentioned strange noises. The old man hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. That house, he said, has been there a long time, longer than most people realize. They say it was built on old ground that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I tried to press him for more details, but he clammed up, shaking his head and muttering something about letting old things lie. His words stuck with me, though. Built on old ground. That night, the footsteps returned, louder than ever. I could hear them pacing beneath me, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The house felt alive, like it was breathing, shifting around me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, my hand trembling as I approached the basement door. The air around it felt colder, sharper, like the house was warning me not to open it. But I couldn't let it control me anymore. I had to know. The door creaked open, and the cold air rushed up from the basement, carrying with it the familiar smell of damp earth and mildew. I flicked on the flashlight and began my descent, the beam of light cutting through the thick darkness. The basement looked the same as always, boxes stacked in the corners, old tools hanging on the wall. But the air was heavier, more oppressive. And in the far corner, near the cracked concrete, I noticed something different, a small patch of water, shimmering faintly in the light. It hadn't rained in days, but the floor was damp, almost slick. And then I heard it again, that faint, scratching noise, like nails dragging across the concrete. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the crack in the floor. The sound was louder now, more frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way up from below. I knelt down, shining the light directly on the crack. The concrete had shifted again, the gap wider than before. The air around it felt colder, sharper, and I could feel the weight of something beneath, something alive. Suddenly the scratching stopped. I held my breath, waiting, listening. For a moment there was nothing but silence, and then the floor moved. It was subtle at first, a small shift, like the earth beneath the concrete was giving way. And then, with a sickening crack, the floor split open, and a wave of freezing air rushed up from below. The smell of decay hit me like a wall, thick and overpowering. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering in the cold air, and from that gaping hole, something began to emerge. At first it was just a shape, a shadow moving in the darkness. But as it crawled out, the beam of light caught its form twisted, skeletal, its flesh rotting and hanging from its bones. It dragged itself forward, its fingers scraping against the concrete, its head turning slowly toward me. It had no eyes, only empty sockets, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze piercing through the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as it opened its mouth, a low, guttural moan escaping from deep within its chest. The sound reverberated through the basement, a hollow echo that seemed to make the very walls tremble. My legs felt like they were cemented to the ground, my body frozen in place as I watched the creature drag itself closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if its body were rebelling against the very act of rising from the earth. I couldn't breathe. Every instinct told me to run, but my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It didn't belong in this world, this thing, this grotesque figure that seemed to defy all logic. My rational mind screamed at me that it wasn't real, that this couldn't be happening, but the stench of decay and the bitter cold that cut through me made it impossible to deny. This was no nightmare. I took a step back, and the creature responded, its head tilting slightly, as if aware of my fear. It dragged itself another few inches forward, leaving a slick trail of dark liquid behind it on the cold concrete. The scratching sound returned, but now I realized it wasn't just nails against stone, it was the sound of bones grinding against each other as it moved, as if its skeletal frame could barely hold itself together. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was Richard Hale, or what was left of him. I thought back to what the old man had said, Hale, locking himself away in the house, his mind deteriorating. Maybe he hadn't gone mad. Maybe the house had done this to him, the same way it was now doing something to me. I tried to shake the thought, to cling to some shred of logic, but the sight in front of me was undeniable. The creature stopped. Its eyeless gaze fixed on me, its mouth opened wider, and from it came a sound, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through my bones. It wasn't human. It was something far older, far darker than any ghost story I had ever heard. Suddenly, the basement felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in around me, suffocating me in the cold, damp air. My heart raced, and my skin felt like it was crawling, like invisible fingers were reaching out to pull me down into the darkness with Hale, or whatever he had become. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't face this thing. I turned and bolted up the stairs, not caring about the noise I made, not even bothering to close the basement door behind me. My only thought was to get out, to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I sprinted through the house, my feet pounding against the wooden floor, every creak of the house now a reminder of the thing that lurked below. When I reached the front door, I yanked it open and ran outside, the night air hitting me like a slap in the face. It was freezing, but it was a welcome cold, a reminder that I was still in the world above, where things made sense, where monsters weren't real. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stood in the driveway staring at the house. It loomed in the darkness, silent, but I could feel it watching me, as if the house itself was alive, as if it had claimed Hale and now wanted me. I didn't know what to do. There was no one to turn to, no one who would believe me if I told them what I had seen. It would sound insane. Hell, it sounded insane, even to me. But the image of that creature, of Hale's twisted, rotting form crawling out of the ground, was burned into my mind. I couldn't unsee it. I stayed outside for what felt like hours, my body numb from the cold, my mind racing. I considered leaving, just getting in my car and driving away, but I knew that wasn't an option. The house was mine legally, financially. But now it was more than that. It was something else's too. Something ancient and terrifying that I couldn't understand. The old man's words came back to me ground that wasn't meant to be disturbed. This house wasn't just a place where someone had died. It was built on something, and whatever that something was, it had taken Hale. It was now trying to take me. I forced myself to go back inside, though every fiber of my being screamed against it. The house was silent again, but the basement door stood wide open at the end of the hallway, as if it was waiting for me. A part of me wanted to grab my things and leave forever, but something stronger, something deeper, told me that running wasn't going to change anything. Whatever was in that house, whatever had clawed its way out of the basement, wasn't going to let me go that easily. For the next few days, I tried to avoid thinking about it, but the fear lingered. The footsteps in the basement had stopped, but the house felt more alive than ever. I could feel its presence in every creak of the floorboards, every gust of cold air that slipped through the windows. I began hearing whispers, soft and indistinct, like voices just out of reach. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't belong. It became impossible to ignore. The house was watching me, waiting. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just stress, that my mind was playing tricks on me after what I'd seen in the basement. But the more I tried to reason with myself, the more the house pushed back. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, and the cold. It seeped into my bones no matter how many blankets I wrapped around myself. One night as I lay in bed, I felt a pressure on my chest, like something was sitting on top of me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And in the darkness, I heard it again, that low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I knew then that I couldn't stay. Whatever was in this house had already taken Richard Hale, and now it wanted me. It had been waiting, biding its time, and now it was ready. I packed a bag that night, grabbed my keys, and left without looking back. I didn't care about the money, the mortgage, or the consequences. I just needed to get out. As I drove away, the house loomed in my rearview mirror, a dark silhouette against the night sky. And for a moment I thought I saw something moving in the windows, a shadow, or maybe a figure, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until the town was far behind me, the house just a distant memory. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That the house, whatever was inside it, still has a hold on me. I dream of it sometimes, of the basement, of the cold, of Richard Hale's twisted body crawling up from the ground. And when I wake, I swear I can still hear the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, pacing beneath me. I don't know if I'll ever be free. But one thing is certain: some places aren't meant to be disturbed. Some things aren't meant to be found. And once you've woken them, they'll never let you go.